Hello, my name is Josh Harkness, and today we'll be doing an analytical review of the 2019 Jacksonville Jaguars. What I hope to achieve through this analysis was to discover the strengths and weaknesses of the Jacksonville Jaguars. An example of this could be that the defense struggles on third downs when they're trying to defend a pass to the right. Another thing I was hoping to discover were the predictable trends. Now, trends don't necessarily mean that there's a strength or weakness, but if the team starts to show trends in a certain area, then other teams are likely to notice it and try to put a stop to it. Lastly, I would like to use the strengths and weaknesses to provide insight into the next draft. For instance, if the team doesn't do well running to the left, they may want to draft an offensive lineman that can help push the defense in that direction. When I first gathered all of my data, it had all of the NFL plays for every single team for the 2019 season. So immediately I had to reduce that down to just the Jacksonville Jaguars, which brought it down to 587 observations from 45,000 observations. After that, the attributes left over were mostly probabilities and also which player made which tackle. For this analysis, I didn't want to look at which players made which tackles and where on the field because I feel like that might overcomplicate it for now. Part of the attribute reduction was also me applying my own knowledge of football to remove further attributes from the dataset. I then broke up the plays into 4 different phases for what I consider would be the most interesting. I removed special teams completely, and instead I kept 4 different datasets representing the pass offense, pass defense, run offense, and run defense. I also created my own Y variable based on the quality of the play. After my knowledge-based reduction, I then used primary component analysis to remove even more attributes. What I didn't really think of before was that safeties and defensive touchdowns, that sort of thing, they're pretty rare to happen, so they're really not going to add much value for the analysis. The graphs below represent the data after I'd already scrubbed out what I didn't find to be valuable attributes. But what I wanted to point out through this analysis was that you could see the primary components were based on very obvious relationships. For instance, first down pass and incomplete pass are going in opposite directions in the first dimension. This seemed pretty obvious since if it's a first down pass, then there's no way it was an incomplete pass. This will be later realized in the Bayesian models. I know the top 2 graphs are hard to see, but in this case they didn't really matter as much, so don't worry about not being able to read them. Through these models, they didn't really provide great insight. So for an example, you would think that maybe pass location middle and quality 0 would be related. So that way, when you pass to the middle, it results in a good play. But you can see that the relationship's already weak. Another example is that the incomplete pass here is pointing to just about every single quality that we have. This didn't really provide any information to me, so there was no reason to really use this model. The model ended up being pretty good at predicting the quality 0 versus quality 4 on the extreme ends, but it was very poor at predicting anything in between. In fact, the model would just predict 0 for everything, but still end up with a decent accuracy because there's only so many plays in each category. Next, I tried the Bayesian models on the passing defense, and kind of underwent the same process, but this time I already had my blacklist created, and that's the graph that you're seeing on the top left. Once again, we're seeing a lot of attributes that are pointing to quite a few different qualities, and that doesn't really, when looking at the graph, that doesn't really inform us of anything. This was another case too where the model was really good at predicting the extremes, but very poor at predicting anything in the middle. And what I started to realize is that this is happening because the qualities at the extremes were very dependent on extreme plays like touchdowns or interceptions. I still went ahead and did primary component analysis for dimension reduction on the rushing, and this time we can see that the analysis actually provides a lot more insight than the passing offense and defense did. There are still some obvious relationships like run location middle not being on the same side as run gap end or run location right, because these are really opposite directions. However, a much less obvious relationship is between run location middle and home team. Hopefully we'll see this in the Bayesian models. The same relationship can be seen over here for the defense between the home team and running to the middle. What this is saying is when the offense is away, they tend to run up the middle more. And we're also seeing this on the defense where when Jacksonville's away, the opposing team tends to run up the middle on them. This is a strange relationship. I'm not quite sure why it's there. Another not super obvious relationship is that The Jacksonville Jaguars tended to scramble out of shotgun more than other formations, and you can see this down here in the first primary component analysis, where shotgun, quarterback scramble, and the quarterback drop back are all pointing down in the same direction. So here we can see the relationship mentioned on the slide before, where out of shotgun, there's likely that the quarterback drops back and then goes for a scramble. It's not going to end up being a designed run most of the time. Another interesting relationship that we can see is that the run gap might be related to the home team. So if Jacksonville's home, maybe they end up running to the guard gap more than the tackle gap. For both the rushing offense and rushing defense, the same thing happened when it came to predicting the quality of play. Only the extremes can be predicted well, and once again, this is likely due to the first downs and touchdowns being tied with quality 0 and quality 4 so strongly. Because the Bayesian models didn't work out as well as I had hoped, I decided to move into an unsupervised learning environment and use k-means clustering instead. With k-means clustering, I wanted to see what would be the best number of clusters to come up with. Ideally, I was hoping it'd be 5 to match the qualities that I created of quality 0 through quality 4, but it didn't turn out to be the case. As you can see with the gap statistics on the left, both of these chose a number of 4. And even with the elbow, it looks like it'd be closer to 3, but 4 is not terrible either. Here we can see that for the passing offense, we wanted to use 4 clusters. So when we had 4 clusters, if you look at the picture on the left, we can see that there is a pretty distinct grouping, except for between 1 and 2. But even still, most of the 2s belong to their own little area here with a few 1s. Then if we look at the silhouettes that Clara created, we can see that the groupings are pretty well fit. There are still like a few that are off and at a low value, but overall the groupings look pretty nice. Here we can see that the sizes are relatively together. Cluster 3 and cluster 4 have a pretty significant difference, but it's not too bad. Also, with each of the attributes, some of them are pretty grouped together where the values don't vary much, but many of them actually do have some pretty good variation. One thing that immediately jumped out at me was cluster 4 as successful plays, and I was immediately able to tell this because cluster 4 is the only cluster where first downs occurred. So looking at this, that immediately tells me, well, if I want to know why my offense is being successful, I should look at cluster 4. Let's look at some attributes that might tell us why it is that cluster 4 is so successful. When we look at cluster 4, we can see that it's the only cluster where the pass length short started to lean more towards being a pass length deep. When I did the dummy variables, I made it so that it would drop the first dummy, and in this case, the first dummy was pass length long. So the pass was either a pass length of short or it was a pass length of long. So the closer that pass length short is to 0, the more likely it is that it was a pass length deep. And here we can see that this is the closest value to 0, so this is telling me that more successful plays were deep passes. Outside of the pass length likely being longer, there isn't other indications that are unique to this cluster that would say, yes, this is why the plays were successful. Another relationship that we can see is that when the team's away, which is in cluster 1, they tend to pass to the right. Now, this is one of those tendencies that was brought up earlier where you want to start being careful of giving away what you're doing. When home, on the other hand, in cluster 2, they don't pass to the right as much. This seems like a little too obvious of a trend that other teams might be able to catch on. Next, we'll look at the passing defense. With the passing defense, we once again ran through the silhouettes to determine the best number of clusters. There really isn't any clear indication. So what I ended up doing here was, because none of the silhouettes provided me with a consistent number to use for the number of clusters, I just decided to stick with the number of qualities that I had at 5. So here, whether you look in the left graph or the right graph, it looks like the clusters are really mixed together. But it's interesting because when we ran Clara for the silhouettes on 5 clusters, there really wasn't too much conflict between the clusters. With this, we did the cluster analysis for the pass defense, and we can see that there's once again a discrepancy with the sizes. It's not terrible again, but I don't like seeing that cluster 2 only had 55. The attributes still are pretty widespread with their values, so it looks like the clustering will give us some information. When looking at the defense, we want the successful attributes to be low. So for instance, with the first down pass, we would want that to be 0, and that'd be successful because that means the defense didn't give up a first down. What we can immediately see out of this is that cluster 4 and 5 appear to be the best clusters for determining weaknesses in the defense. Every play in cluster 4 is a first down, and in cluster 5 half of the plays are. And when they're not first downs, they're still marked as first downs if there was a touchdown on the play. And in clusters 4 and 5, we can see that these have the highest values for touchdowns, which means that it was most likely that touchdowns occurred in these clusters. There is a little bit for cluster 3, but the value is still much lower than in clusters 4 and 5. So let's try and figure out where is it that the defense is performing poorly. So in cluster 5, we can immediately see a relationship where the pass length is short and the pass is over the middle. So this tells us that one of the weaknesses in the defense might be short passes over the middle. With cluster 4, we're not seeing really any obvious situations. Really, the only weakness that we might be able to see with the defense is that when the offense comes out in a non-shotgun play, that's when the defense is weak to passes, because they're most likely anticipating that it's going to be a run. So here we're going to look at the rushing offense. And if you remember earlier, before the Bayesian models, we had showed that the primary component analysis was much better at showing relationships with the running offense. So let's hope with this, we're going to see more of a difference in the values. So here with the silhouette analysis, we can see that each time it selected 4 as the best number of clusters to use. Even in the elbow method, you can see a sharp elbow at the cluster of 4. The two outside graphs here seem to give conflicting results. In the left graph, we can see that the clusters of 1 and 4 are really grouped together, so it's hard to tell a difference. But then when you look over here, 1 and 4 are pretty separated right on this line about here. Really, the right graph makes it look like clusters 2 and 3 are kind of combined and hard to tell apart. When we look at the Claire silhouettes, it looks like cluster 3 is the cluster that's having a hard time determining where the values should be. Even the non-negative values are still very low. So that shows me that perhaps the right graph is closer to reality, where 2 and 3 are being mixed together. Outside of cluster 3 though, it does look like the data is pretty well explained. Now when we look at the actual numbers here, the sizes of the clusters are a little bit more concerning this time, where we have a cluster of size 52 and a cluster of size 140, but we're just going to continue on. Also, the values within the attributes don't appear as widespread as we had seen with the passing, which is kind of shocking since with the primary component analysis, it looked like the differences were going to be a little more obvious this time. If you remember back when you looked at the primary component analysis, we had noticed that there was a relationship between the quarterback scrambling and during shotgun, and here we can see that relationship in cluster 3. When we look at cluster 3, we can see that a lot of the plays are out of shotgun, and all of those plays are a quarterback drop back or scramble. Another thing that we can see is that when the quarterback does scramble, it looks like it's pretty heavily on third down, especially more compared to the other clusters, where there really isn't a lot of running on third down. What this tells me is that because it's a quarterback drop back, it's likely a pass situation, but perhaps no one's able to get open or the quarterback's immediately feeling pressured, so he starts to run. And when he does this, he's not very successful when getting first downs, because when we look at cluster 3 and we look at the first downs, while the value is higher than the other clusters, it's still only 38%, so even when he's scrambling in these situations, he's not really getting first downs. This is also putting quite possibly the most valuable person in your franchise at risk by having him run so much. When a quarterback's at risk like this is when you want to start looking at the draft and thinking about maybe drafting offensive linemen or receivers that can get open quicker so that the quarterback can get the ball off faster. Now we'll look at the last portion of our data, which is the rushing defense. Here we can see that the silhouettes looks like 4 is the best. Here we have 6 as the best. Here we have 6 at the best. And then looking at the elbow here, I do like the bend there at 4. The bend at 6 looks nice too. But when it comes to picking 4 or 6, ideally my number was at 5, so we can't use that because they're both 1 away. So instead I'm going to go with the lowest K, just because ideally that's what you normally want. I did end up analyzing both of these at 4 and 6, and 4 did end up looking better. When we look at the graph on the left, this is by far the best clustering that we've had so far. Each cluster is very distinct. Cluster 1 is all the way to the left, cluster 2 is right here in the middle, 3 is in the upper right, and then 4 is on the bottom right. Even when you look at the graph on the right, yeah, cluster 1's kind of all over the place, but cluster 4, 3, and 2 are all pretty well separated. There is a little bit of a combination here between 2 and 3, but it's still not bad. So when we look at our silhouettes, this also looks like the best silhouettes that we've had in the entire analysis. First though, let's look at the sizes. The sizes are pretty well spread out. It would be nice to see this 163 drop down a bit, but it's really not too bad. Once again, too, the attributes aren't too widespread until we look at the gaps, where each cluster is actually focused on an individual gap. When we look, we can see that the run gap to the end is in cluster 1, the run gap for cluster 2 is behind the tackle. For cluster 3, well, it doesn't show a 1 for any of the gaps, so what does this mean? Well, this is our dummy variables again, where the first one was removed. So in this case, when they're all 0, then that means that the run gap was the center. And then cluster 4 focuses on the run gap with the guard. So how is it that the clustering focused so well on this? In the NFL, gap play is key for the defense. So here, because we're looking at the same defense for every single play, it looks like we're noticing where the defense is strong and weak when it comes to the gaps that they're supposed to cover. So let's look at cluster 1 first, which is the ability for the defense to stop runs to the end or to the outside. Here we can see that the most touchdowns are given up when they run to the outside, even though not by too much. It looks like in cluster 3, which is the runs in the center, those are also the most touchdowns. That's probably similar to what we were seeing before from the Jaguars offense, where when teams get close to the goal line, they are just running up the middle trying to plow through. And let's see if that's true. Okay, so when we look at the goal to go, we do see that 3 is the highest, which is right up the middle, but they still run to the edge even at goal to go. So there isn't a huge difference there, which means that the defense probably is pretty weak at stopping runs to the outside. We can also see that rushes to the outside, which is cluster 1, has the highest value of first down rush, which means they're giving up the most first downs when they run to the outside. So let's see is it when they run to the right, to the left that the outside's weak? Well, you can't run to the middle if you're running outside. So when we look at the run location, it looks like it's more towards the left than to the right. It's not by a huge amount, but it does make it look like running to the left is going to provide the team with more success against the Jaguars defense. This might mean that the outside linebackers are having a hard time getting to their edge, or maybe the defensive line isn't engaging in their blocks well enough. That's up to the coach to determine. Stepping through the cluster analysis can be a little cumbersome and hard to follow. Instead, what I would present to an NFL coach is these bullet points here, and if they wanted to know how I came up to this, that's when I would go back and show the cluster analysis and how it is that I drew to each of those conclusions. Of course, it'd be nice to have the coach looking at the cluster analysis because they're likely to see some relationships that I don't understand, such as the gap assignments as much. But overall, you can see the total breakdown here. Some improvements that could be made for the analysis could include placing more emphasis on the players involved in each play. So in the NFL, there's a lot of position specialists, especially on defense, where they're edge rushers and they come in on known downs. But I want to focus more on the first string personnel, where they're going to be in play in and play out, so that way it can allow for a more consistent analysis. Another thing that I think would improve it is the injuries. So with the Jacksonville Jaguars in 2019, Gardner Minshew had to come in for the hurt Nick Foles, which was the quarterback. Now, changing a quarterback likely has a pretty significant impact on the analysis because one quarterback might be more likely to scramble than the other, or maybe one likes one receiver more than the other, which changes the side of the field they pass to. So in the future, I would like to separate out to see the tendencies that players have instead of just looking at an offense as solely just an offense. Something that could have improved the data analysis is if I had used another form of clustering, like some sort of supervised clustering like K&N. The supervised learning could be based on either the quality variable that I created, or maybe on first downs, maybe on touchdowns, and that sort of thing. Thank you for listening to the presentation, and have a good night.